Hi, welcome everyone. I am so glad to be here, and it is so wonderful to have so many of you across different cities tuning in today. And today we're going to be talking about traumatic brain injury. And it is especially important because this month, the month of March, is Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month. And we have a great program with experts and people who are going to be talking to us about their personal experience. And I really want to make sure that everyone who's out there listening today, tuning in, that if you know someone who can benefit from today's conversation, please feel free to grab them right now and bring them into the room with you. Also, you might want to send them the link once we provide that so that you can share this information with them. I also invite you to get a notebook, a pen, or a pencil so you can write down all this information that we're going to be sharing with you. And also maybe your warm cup of tea or coffee since it's a little gloomy here where we are. Again, I'm Marta Rañón. I'm the Executive Vice President at Southern Caregiver Resource Center, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. We have a full agenda and we have a lot of great speakers, but I just really want to make sure that all of you who are listening today, especially caregivers, family caregivers who are caring for someone with a traumatic brain injury, that you know that you are not alone, that we are here to help you, that there are resources available so that you can be a better caregiver or so you can manage some of those challenges. We know that caregiving is not easy. We know that caregiving for someone with what is considered an invisible wound is not easy. Many times it's a little bit even more challenging because that person might not be able to fully express what they are feeling or what they are struggling with. And then we might not have an idea of what is going on. So it is a very really precarious situation that sometimes caregivers find themselves in. And right now, during this time, with this pandemic, a lot of caregivers are feeling that stress, are feeling overwhelmed and burdened because we don't have these resources available to us, like networks, friends that we used to rely on to kind of get away and take a break. So it is important that you seek help, that you reach out. And again, that you know that we are here to help. Now, in case you are not familiar with Southern Caregiver Resource Center, we are a leading provider of caregiver services in San Diego County, and we actually provide services to Imperial counties as well. But don't fret, because if you don't live in San Diego County, you can still access a lot of our archives or information or services online. So if you go to www.scrc.care, you can find a lot of available information like our iCare portal. Our iCare portal is our digital library of resources. We have live stream classes such as this one that will be there eventually. We have 1 minute tip videos. So if you tell me I don't have time, but you do have a minute while you're waiting at the doctor's office, then you can click on our 1 minute tip videos and learn something that can be helpful to you. We also have podcasts, and we talk about all kinds of topics related to caregiving, and our online newsletter. And there you can get lots of great articles and watch videos. So again, we want to make sure that you know that we are here to support you, the family caregiver. So like I said earlier, being that it's this topic, navigating care and caring for someone with a traumatic brain injury, we turned to an old friend of ours, and he is such a wonderful speaker, brings a wealth of experience, and is so has such great energy that I love listening to him. And we're so honored that he's going to be here with us, talking to us about this topic. His name is Clint Pearman. He's a certified brain injury specialist trainer with the Academy of Certified Brain Injury Specialists, ACBIS, and the Regional Education Coordinator for the Traumatic Brain Injury Center of Excellence at the Intrepid Spirit Center, Naval Hospital Camp Pendleton. In this role, he provides education and training on the prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and rehabilitation of traumatic brain injury to the military community, veteran population, civilian, and nonprofit organizations. As a veteran, Clint served over 31 years in the United States Marine Corps, had multiple deployments, and held numerous leadership positions. Clint holds a bachelor's degree in health and wellness, a master's degree in health psychology, and he is a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona with a research interest in the effects of self-directed neuroplasticity techniques for the health behavior change. And he's also a certified brain injury specialist trainer with the Academy of Certified Brain Injury Specialists. As you can see, Clint is an expert in this field, and I am so happy to welcome a friend, Clint Pearman.
Awesome introduction, Martha. As I always say, whenever I get a chance to speak for your organization, the Southern Caregivers Resource Center, I have a soft spot in my heart because I did not know, and I'm not going to go into this story because I don't have the same amount of time I've had in the past, but just to give a little background, I have a personal interest in this field, the caregiver field, because I didn't know I was a caregiver. I spent the last 2 years of my mom's life living with her and not having a clue that what I was doing was actually caregiving. And if someone had actually asked me back then or said, hey, do you know you're a caregiver? I probably would have said, no, I'm not. I didn't know what it was. It wasn't until maybe 7 or 8 years later when I first began researching my initial talk for the Southern Caregivers Resource Center, maybe 5 years ago, as I'm researching it, it dawned on me, wow, I was a caregiver. And ever since then, I have always been interested in the caregiving field and how I can help and support and contribute to that. So I'm excited that you guys invited me back again for maybe, I think this is the 4th or 5th time, and I'm excited. Hopefully I'm going to get to introduce some of my colleagues that can support people around the nation that do similar work to what I do, that are part of the TBI Center of Excellence. Now, we are a government organization. We're part of the Department of Defense Health Agency. So with that, I do need to go to the next slide. I do need to cover the disclaimer. So the views expressed in this presentation are those of the author, and they do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of the Defense Health Agency, Department of Defense, or any other government agency. This work was prepared under that contract number with the DHA contracting officer, and therefore is defined as government work. So I am working for the government, and this is government work. It's copyright protected, is not available for any work of the U.S. government. And this is an oral presentation for the Southern Caregivers Resource Center. For more information on the TBI Center of Excellence, I like to make it simple and say we're the TBI specialists and experts for the DOD. And as a regional education coordinator, there's 15 of us spread out around the country. We are essentially the traumatic brain injury education, training, and resources specialists. And I like to say, if the word TBI ever comes up and you're not sure what to do, find your local regional education coordinator with the TBI Center of Excellence. We can point you in the right direction. Now, because we are focused on the military community, which includes active duty service members, veterans, and family members, but our contract allows us to provide the same resources, this education, information, and training to the civilian community. So this is where I get excited. I get to come and share with the Southern Caregivers Resource Center and all of you guys that are attending this, some of the stuff that we have learned through the Department of Defense and the TBI Center of Excellence. I get to share that with you, and you can take advantage of it. So while some of the slides you're about to see is it'll use military terminology, and you can tell the things that are directed towards the military, 80% of it, 80 to 90% of what I am going to share with you, it applies directly to what you're doing as a caregiver. If you are not associated with a service member, veteran, or the military, so it doesn't matter. This applies to what it applies to you. So let's go to the next slide. And if everyone is ready, let's go ahead and get going. The objectives, we're going to cover 4 primary topics. We're going to learn about traumatic brain injury basics. This gives you the foundation to almost everything you need to know. And it is not that complicated. I'm going to walk you through to make TBI basics simple for you. You're going to learn how to recognize TBI signs and symptoms. And then we're going to cover understanding common concerns for the caregiver. So once you have the TBI basics out of the way, I'm going to then tie that into common concerns that a TBI caregiver needs to be aware of. Now, while the slide says common concerns for TBI caregiver, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about applies to any caregiver. It will apply to, it doesn't matter what it'll apply to all forms of caregiving. And then I'll identify military caregiving resources, which also applies to everyone. So don't let the slides and the terminology fool you into thinking it's limited just to the military. It applies to you. So next slide. So let's talk about a definition of TBI right up front. The first thing we need to know is, what is a TBI? Because many people are not familiar with what a TBI is. And I would even ask this question. How many of you listening to this, whether you're a caregiver or a person living with a traumatic brain injury, how many of you have ever had a traumatic brain injury? What I found is somewhere around 60% and more of any audience that I have presented this topic to would believe they never had a TBI because they don't know what a TBI is. So now let's learn what a traumatic brain injury is. In order to have a traumatic brain injury, and we're going to narrow this down to concussion in a moment, but in order to have a traumatic brain injury, 2 things have to occur. The first one is there has to be an event where you are exposed to a blow or jolt to the head or the body. Now, you're going to get the DOD definition on the next slide, but let me give you the simple definition. A traumatic brain injury occurs when you experience a blow or jolt to the head or the body. In other words, you hit your head or something hits you in the head or your body. And what can happen, here is what causes the TBI. So imagine this is your brain. It sits in your skull. Now, it is not strapped in your skull like a helmet. It literally floats around in your skull, attached to your brain stem, surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid. So when you have that blow or jolt, or you hit your head or your body, your brain can then smash into the inside of your skull and rattle around. Depending on how much rattling around and how hard it smashes into the inside of your skull will help predict the level of TBI you may experience, whether it will be mild, moderate, or severe. So that something like that has to occur first. A blow or jolt to the head or the body. Now I have to add this, because we hit our heads all the time and we don't have a traumatic brain injury. Let me clear that up. We hit our heads all the time and we don't experience traumatic brain injuries. However, if you ever hit your head or your body, and as a result, you experience one of these 3 signs, these are not symptoms, these are what we call signs, and you experience one of these 3 signs, you've met the criteria for a traumatic brain injury diagnosis or assessment. So what are the 3 signs? The first one, as the slide said, is called AOC, stands for alteration of consciousness. That means if you've ever hit your head or your body, and as a result of hitting your head or your body, you were dazed, confused. Maybe you saw stars or you felt the pressure and maybe ringing in the ears. In other words, you were dazed, confused, or disoriented as a result of hitting your head or your body. That meets the criteria for a traumatic brain injury. The second one, loss of consciousness. Now, this is the obvious. And the LOC or AOC, alteration of consciousness, lasts less than 24 hours. Now, the reason I say less than 24 hours is because if you are dazed or confused as a result of a blow or jolt to the head or the body, so let's give an example. Let's say you were in a car accident. You ran into something, the airbag exploded, and you hit your head really hard, and then you were dazed or confused. If that lasts longer than 24 hours, that may meet the criteria for a moderate or severe. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Right now, we're discussing the concussion version, which is the same thing as a mild. So, alteration of consciousness less than 24 hours meets the criteria for the mild. Now, loss of consciousness. If you've ever hit your head or your body and you got knocked out or you lost consciousness, that meets the criteria for a concussion for less than 30 minutes. So if you were unconscious for less than 30 minutes, meets the criteria for concussion. Now, if you're unconscious for longer than that, that may meet the criteria for a moderate or severe. So let me back up a moment. TBIs come in three versions: mild, moderate, and severe. The mild is also referred to as a concussion. And we're talking about the concussion version right now. We'll talk more about the other levels, moderate and severe, in the next coming slides. So in the case of loss of consciousness, if you ever hit your head or your body and you lost consciousness, meets the criteria. Now, sometimes I have service members that will say, well, I was only knocked out for like a few seconds. Well, the criteria doesn't say just a few seconds. It says a loss of consciousness. So that would meet the criteria if it was less than 30 minutes. Now, the next one, post-traumatic amnesia. That means you hit your head or your body and you cannot remember what happened, either right before or right after the event. That meets the criteria. Let me give an example. Had a service member, he was walking up to the back of a large vehicle to get on the vehicle when he stumbled and hit his face on the back of the vehicle. When he hit his face, the other service members ran over to him to ask, so, hey, are you all right? And that service member goes, what happened? He didn't know what happened. That meets the criteria. So some key points for understanding whether a TBI has occurred. First, loss of consciousness is not required. Remember, there are three things: LOC, loss of consciousness; AOC, alteration of consciousness; or PTA, post-traumatic amnesia. Symptoms alone do not equate to a diagnosis. Now, we have not talked about symptoms yet. We're going to get into that in a moment. But just because you have symptoms doesn't mean you've had a TBI, because many symptoms of TBI are symptoms of other types of illnesses. For example, one of the symptoms for TBI is sleep problems. Well, many people have sleep problems that are not TBI related. A CT scan is not indicated for most patients with a mild TBI. This is important. What that is saying is, if it is believed you've had a mild, which is a concussion, it's not necessary to do a CT scan. However, many emergency rooms will automatically do a CT scan if you show up with anything similar or remotely related to a traumatic brain injury. They run a CT scan. So I should tell a story that you should be aware of. Here's an example. Service member was playing softball. He was the catcher. Another player ran into him and knocked the service member out. Ran into him and knocked him out. That met the criteria for a traumatic brain injury. That service member recovered within a few seconds, but by the time he recovered, they had already called 911. The ambulance showed up, did their thing, took the service member to the emergency room. The emergency room ran the CT scan, and it came back negative. And the emergency room thought that everything is okay. You don't have any contusions. We don't see anything wrong with your brain. sent a service member away thinking it was okay. No, that service member had a TBI because he met the criteria. There was a blow or jolt to the head of the body and a loss of consciousness occurred. That met the criteria for a TBI. So be aware, the CT scan doesn't actually diagnose a concussion. It tells you whether it may be more severe than the mild. Symptom severity does not define TBI classification. Remember, TBIs come in 3 versions: mild, moderate, and severe. The severity of the symptoms, when we get to them, they don't predict or they don't define whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. What defines whether it's mild, moderate, or severe is on the next slide. Next slide. So this is how, now I'm not going to go into details here, but this is how we determine whether the TBI is mild, moderate, or severe. So if you look down the left side, we talk about structural imaging. That's if they did some type of a CT scan. And then we have loss of consciousness, alteration of consciousness, and post-traumatic amnesia. To meet the requirement for the mild, you'll notice the structural imaging, which is the CT scan, it's normal. But we just talked about that, so we know why. The brain injury at the mild level is not significant or severe enough to show up on the CT scan. So that would meet the criteria for the mild version. And then we talked about from 0 to 30 minutes of loss of consciousness, alteration of consciousness, meaning your days confused or disoriented, lasting up to 24 hours, and then post-traumatic amnesia, lasting up to a day. That meets the criteria for the mild. However, if you look at the moderate, that's the criteria to meet the criteria for the moderate. If they were unconscious from 30 minutes to 24 hours would meet the moderate criteria. If they had alteration of consciousness lasting longer than 24 hours, meets the criteria for the moderate or severe. And then post-traumatic amnesia from greater than 1 day to 7 days. And then for the severe, you can see the criteria there. Now, this is not something you really need to worry about. If you believe someone that you're associated with may have had a traumatic brain injury, first step is seek medical attention. Unless you are a medical professional, it's the best advice I can give you is to seek medical care at that point. Next slide. So we are aware, I'm going to talk about symptoms in a moment, a little bit more in detail. However, also be aware, TBI symptoms do overlap post-traumatic stress symptoms. So sometimes the same event that caused the TBI can also be the same event associated with causing post-traumatic stress. And then symptoms can overlap. The medical professional can figure out which one to treat, and that's their realm, that's their territory. Next slide. So let's talk about symptoms. Symptoms, this slide here is kind of busy, but if you can see it, and the reason it says draft is because the TBI Center of Excellence, we are in the process of updating this, and we put it in the draft mode temporarily until it's updated, and then the updated one will come out. But it'll be pretty close to this. But I'm going to give you a little more details on TBI symptoms. Symptoms come or can be defined into 3 categories, can be categorized into 3 categories. We have physical symptoms, and I'm going to touch on that. We have cognitive symptoms, and then emotional symptoms. So let's talk about physical symptoms first. Physical symptoms involve things like having a headache. So you've hit your head or your body. We've identified LOC, AOC, or PTA, and then symptoms show up, which could be headaches, sleep disturbances, dizziness, balance problems, and then nausea or vomiting. These are all TBI symptoms. And in my 31 years in the military, I've actually experienced 7 TBIs. And at the end of my 31 years is when many of my symptoms seem to have emerged. Now, we don't know for sure whether my headaches, my sleep problems, my balance problems were all directly related to the 7 TBIs I had. However, when I got TBI treatment, those symptoms seem to have resolved. So that's a hint. There are things a person can do when you have these types of symptoms. So those are the physical symptoms. Now we also have cognitive symptoms. Cognitive symptoms are things like slower thinking, poor concentration, memory problems, and difficulty finding words, where you notice as a result of that blow or jolt, you now notice maybe your thinking has slowed down. You have to really think about what you want to say, when in the past you didn't need to do that. Or your memory, you've noticed memory issues, and then difficulty finding words that used to just flow. Now you have to stop and kind of think. I realize that what they call senior moments. And then when I went and got educated, which is the key to TBI or concussion treatment and rehabilitation, getting education, I seem to have resolved many of those challenges. So that's another point there. There are things you can do when you find a medical professional that's familiar with TBI treatment and rehabilitation. And then the last symptoms are emotional symptoms. That involves things like feeling anxious, feeling depressed, irritability, and mood swings. These are all symptoms. And the smartest thing I like to say is, if you're noticing these symptoms, don't try to self-diagnose and self-treat. Seek a medical professional that's familiar with these types of symptoms. Now you have the basics of TBI. Next slide. Let's talk about caregivers now. Now let's tie in what we've just covered over the next 15 minutes. Let's tie this into the business of being a caregiver. Now, at the top of the list, when we talk about being a caregiver, whether you're a caregiver for a TBI patient, a person that has experienced a traumatic brain injury, or you're the caregiver for any other type of person, doesn't matter. Some of these topics relate to everything. And here's the big one. You have to pay attention to your own health. You cannot support the person you're the caregiver for if your own health starts to fail. And I remember when I was working when I started living with my mom, I was stressed out. I had anxiety issues. I couldn't figure out why I was having headaches all the time. I realized years later it was the stress of being a caregiver. Even if you don't know you're a caregiver, there can be stress involved in that. So some things we need to be aware of. When you talk about your own health, you got social and emotional challenges that you want to pay attention to. We already talked about the physical symptoms and the cognitive symptoms. There can be a feeling of loss related to the changes that are now going on. Because as Martha mentioned in the beginning, when you are involved in helping someone or when you become a caregiver, that can be a life-changing event. It can sometimes last months to years, and in some cases, it can become a lifetime, an entire lifetime of taking care of someone. And there are things you can do, and we're going to get to those in a moment. So there can be anxiety issues related to caregiving, re-injury concerns with whether the person will re-injure themselves, caregiver strain, and the big one we're going to discuss, caregiver burden, stress, and a feeling of being overwhelmed. These are all topics I'm going to touch on a little bit more as we go to the next slide. And I want you to remember the caregiver burden. So other caregiver concerns are the emotional factors that you may go through, the social factors that will be involved. You may find that now that you've become a caregiver, you don't get to spend that much time with your social network because depending on how severe the person you're working with, their injury is, it may be a full-time job, full-time position, taking care of your loved one. And then there are physical factors that you have to worry about, not only with the person you're working with, but yourself. And then we already talked about the cognitive factors related to caregiver concerns Those are also factors you have to take into account for yourself. Next slide. So, caregiver burnout. This is a big one. Caregiver burnout results from all the stress and anxiety that may come along with becoming a caregiver. It's a state, as the slide says, caregiver burnout is a state of emotional or physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion and distress that may include depression, agony, and anxiety issues. And it can negatively affect the way you care for your loved one. It may change your attitude. I remember in my case, I started realizing I just started getting angry at things. I didn't know why, but there were times when my mom would come in. I had the most loving mom. She would come in and want to know if I wanted her to cook breakfast. And I would get angry because I'm taking care of her and I didn't want to have to worry about cooking breakfast for her grown-up son. And for some reason I would snap at her, and I realized it was from the stress and possibly caregiver burnout. So your attitude may change. In order to cope with your feelings of you must effectively and figure out ways to prevent burnout. And we're going to touch on some of those in a moment. It's important that you know your strengths, where you may need help as a caregiver, which is a big one. Hopefully I'll get to talk about that. There are things that you don't want to be afraid to do. You don't want to be afraid to ask for help as a caregiver. And then there are resources that are available. You're on the call, the presentation that's put on by the Southern Caregivers Resource Center. They have an enormous network of resources. If you have not been to their website, go there. If you are a service member, a caregiver associated with a service member, the TBI Center of Excellence has an amazing website with tons of resources that we'll actually touch on here in a moment for caregivers that are taking care of someone with a TBI. But many of our resources at the TBI Center of Excellence website, they apply to many different areas of caregiving. Next slide. So under healthcare or under caregiver resources, your healthcare team. If there is a healthcare team involved in the care of your loved one, they are a resource. Do not be afraid to ask them questions. In fact, let me touch on some notes I took related to working with your healthcare team. First, this is important. Understand, we know how important the family unit and the family members are to the rehabilitation and the treatment of a loved one, especially in the case of traumatic brain injuries. We know how important the family member is. So you want to first realize you are an important component of the healthcare team as a family member. Get to know. So here's a list of things you want to do as a family member. First, get to know the healthcare team. The more they know you, the more they understand your concerns, the more you're able to communicate with them, the better they are equipped to answer and literally listen to your questions. If there are case managers involved, get to know the case managers. Don't be afraid to ask questions to the case managers. Keep a notebook. Being a caregiver can be overwhelmingly confusing with all the things you have to be concerned with. So get a notebook that you can use to take notes with on a regular basis. Don't be afraid, big one. Don't be afraid to actually ask for help. Some of the things you can do to stay organized is keep a notebook to keep things in to help you stay organized. For example, keep a notebook to help you keep and track personal information on the loved one you're caring for. You'll need a notebook to keep track of medical and medication that the person may be taking. You should have a notebook where you can keep medical tests and medical reports that are important. A notebook to keep notes for questions. So throughout your day, you may think of something you need to ask, you're not sure of. Go to your notebook and write down the notes that you can then carry with you when you attend any treatment for your loved one. Keep a notebook that you can use to house resources and information. I'm going to show you a list of other resources in a moment. You'll want to have a notebook that you could write these resources down. Now, this could go into one big binder with tabs on it that you can flip through to get to the sections you want, or some people may just have separate notebooks. And then a notebook for important papers that you may want to have. So your resources, the healthcare team. There are counseling for TBI support and educational groups. This is a great educational group right here, the Southern Caregivers Resource Center. They have enormous educational resources on their website, and they may talk about this more later. TBI, for the TBI Center of Excellence, we have videos. So if you're caring for a person with TBI that's living with a traumatic brain injury and they're a veteran, service member, or military associated, we have videos, we have podcasts, an amazing set of podcasts that can provide more education and resources. And then there are TBI related websites. In the case of the TBI Center of Excellence, our brand new website that we are now connected with is a great source. And if you're caring for a person with a TBI, that's the first place you should go. Go there and you'll see a list of resources for providers, for caregivers, for patients. Click on the one you are, and then just start educating yourself on the various resources that are available to you. Next slide. TBI Family Podcast. The Southern Caregivers Resource Center these guys have a great podcast. And in the case of TBI, we have an amazing podcast that was launched back in 2016. It's a series that was dedicated to caregivers of service members and veterans that are living with traumatic brain injury. And each episode offers information and resources and tips specifically focused on caregivers. And you'll get to hear other caregivers sharing stories. You can listen to the TBI family episodes, or you can even download them via SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play. And it's located at our website, www.health.mil/TBI Family Podcast. Next slide. So the DoD, if you're part of the DoD network and you're caring for a loved one with the TBI, we have tons of resources. We have the TBI Caregiver Resource Directory, military caregiver pair forums. There's a monthly caregiver information that comes out on a regular basis, virtual peer forums, military family learning network, entire network for family members caring for loved ones that may be living with a traumatic brain injury. And we put on caregiver related events. And we also provide specialized resources for caregivers taking care of service members living or veterans living with traumatic brain injury. Next slide. We have the International Resource Directory. This is the part where I said you may want to take notes. We have the Caregiver Resource Directory you can find. Family Caregiver Alliance, Military One Source, Blue Star Families, and Operation Family Caregivers. Some of you that are associated with Southern Caregivers Resource Center may be familiar with the Operation Family Caregiver Network. These are all resources that you as a caregiver for a service member experiencing or living with a traumatic brain injury, these are all resources that are available for you. Next slide. For more information, you can contact us at the VA. Oh, let me add a piece. There is the VA Caregiver Support Network also. And that's what this slide is referring to. So if you're caring for a veteran, there is an entire VA network that's dedicated to caregivers. So there are tons of organizations that are available to take care of caregivers. And what's interesting is this: in the early days of the caregiver treatment and rehabilitation field, medical professionals focused exclusively on the care and treatment of the person living with the injury. In other words, they focused exclusively on the person living with the injury. And then they realized over time, the healthcare profession realized that the family and family members are an important, critically important component to the rehabilitation, treatment, and recovery from a traumatic brain injury. And for that matter, most other caregiving concerns, the family member is an important integral component. So in the case of TBI, there is an entire VA caregiver support network that's available. And as you already know, the Southern Caregivers Resource Center here in Southern California is another important local network. Next slide. We at the Traumatic Brain Injury Center of Excellence, we have an amazing document this here. In fact, some of the stuff that I have talked about came out of this document. Now, this is a thick doc. Well, if you're looking to get really specific details and a deep understanding of traumatic brain injury, caregiving, resources, education, and information, this is the document you want. It's under revision right now and should be ready in the summer of 2021. You can download it now and it will give you a ton of information. Now, next slide. If you want the basics though, I think it's on. Yeah, here we go. Here's the basic information. If you're caring for a loved one or someone with a traumatic brain injury, these documents here, these are little pamphlets you can download from our website. And the first one, Addressing Family Needs. This is a really important document because it covers things that a family needs to be concerned with when it comes to traumatic brain injury. However, the next one, Taking Care of Yourself While Taking Care of Others. This is critically important. If you are caring for someone, it doesn't matter whether it's TBI related or not, I encourage you to download that document there so that you can learn some of the things you want to take into account that are associated with family resiliency when it comes to caregiving. What are the things you have to be concerned with? How do you deal with stress and depression? There are tips and information and tools that you can get from that document. Then what are the things you can do for topics related to, as I mentioned, stress or anxiety? Those are all spelt out in that document. Now, if you have to talk to children, that's what the second document is, talking with children about TBI. And then the last one, talking with children about moderate to severe TBIs. Next slide. Some key takeaways: no two people are exactly alike, and no two brains are exactly alike. So if you're caring for a loved one with the TBI, seek medical help first. Now, sometimes creating new normal, we often say we want to get back to normal. In some occasions, you may have to create a new normal, and this may require developing a positive attitude and the concept of having patience and perseverance. I like to call that resiliency, the ability to bounce back. You want to take advantage of the many military caregiver resources we just covered. Keep in mind that those challenges with those persons living with the TBI, they can live full lives with purpose and dignity, and with the help of the caregiver advocating for their treatment and rehabilitation, it can facilitate that process even better. Next slide. I think we ended just in time for questions, or do I still have time? I think we're open now for questions.
Clint, it is always such a pleasure to listen to you talk and to listen to the information that you share. I really I love your energy, but also your experience and the fact that you can talk about being a caregiver, but also have experienced yourself these
I
challenges
know.
as a person that had TBI. My goodness, Clint, it's so great that you're doing so amazing, and we're so lucky to have you here today. I did have a
Thank
couple of things that I wanted to maybe one or two questions before we go on to our next speaker, and then what we'll do is, if you hang in there, we'll bring back both of you and have a Q&A for both of you at the end as well. But I just wanted to touch on the fact that you said the importance of the family, that family is key to rehabilitation, to the treatment process, to the support, and to the help. It is a unit, and so many times we forget about that. There's so much emphasis put on the individual that has the challenge, or has the disease, or has the concern, the health situation, but we forget about the importance of family. So I just wanted to say, I'm so glad that you do focus on that and that you see the value. I wanted to to go along with that is, how do you convince, Clint? How do you convince someone who may have suffered a traumatic brain injury, might not realize that that's what happened, and then the family is saying, I think you need to go to the doctor. I think you need to get treatment, and they are reluctant to do that. What do you do there, Clint?
I can speak from my perspective in the area I work in the military. Now, your question is extremely important because many people don't believe there's anything wrong with them, especially if the TBI has now interfered with their cognitive ability. So they're simply not thinking clear. But we got to add this, especially in the war fighter industry. We have this mentality that we're war fighters, and if we cannot see the injury, there's nothing wrong with us. Plus, in many occasions in the warfighter field, service members, they're reluctant to report TBI injuries because, first, they think it makes them look weak. Let me dispel that if there are any service members listening to that. The DOD even wants us to report our TBIs, and it doesn't make you look weak. As a retired 31-year Marine, I can tell you it makes you look strong when you're able to say, hey, something's wrong. I need to go get checked out. So the first step is to realize that reporting a traumatic brain injury doesn't make you look weak. The second thing is this: those in the leadership positions have to learn and realize that many times people are not going to report the TBI because they believe it makes them feel weak. And the other reason is they think you are not going to support them. So as a family member working with an individual that you believe has had a TBI, in fact, you don't even have to believe it. I just taught you how the medical professions diagnose a TBI. Now, unless you're a medical professional, you don't diagnose, but you can assess. If you can identify there was a blow or jolt to the head or the body, and they experience any of those three signs: loss of consciousness, alteration of consciousness, or post-traumatic amnesia, you know they had a TBI. Now, if the symptoms are showing up later, because in many cases, most people recover from a concussion within 90 days. 80% of people that have had a concussion, remember, that's the mild version. And that's the version you have to worry about, because it can be so mild that you think you're all right. And other people are the people that can recognize things are wrong. In the case of the moderate and severe, usually the person knows something is wrong. But in the case of the mild, the best way to, you had used the term convince. It's hard to convince somebody of something they don't want. I say just show that you love them, you care about them, you're interested in them, and share with them what you know. You can tell them, hey, I attended this training. This is what that we were taught, and we know you were in a car accident, or you fell down the steps or the ladder, and this is what happened. We know you had a TBI. You can get treatment because the medical profession, there are things we can do. You don't have to just struggle like when I was growing up with the TBIs I experienced, not knowing that there were things you can do. So hopefully that answers that question a little bit. At the foundation to that question, though, is this: the single most important component to concussion treatment and rehabilitation is education, not only for the person living with the TBI, but if you're the caregiver, you have to keep learning, keep learning, and keep learning. And if you love this person enough to where you're stressing over them getting treatment, you just have to learn more, keep learning. And eventually,
Absolutely.
and
Learning is the key.
yes.
Thank you, Clint. Well, hold tight because we're going to bring you back at the end for more questions. We are getting a lot of questions through our audience, but at this time, I want to introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is Brittany Fuller. She graduated with her master's degree in social work from Baylor University. From there, she pursued helping the most vulnerable of populations, which brought her to realize the lack of help and services offered to those individuals caring for those in need. She has spent much of the last 4 years caregiving, studying and navigating the challenges of this very important but overlooked role. And in Brittany's free time, she enjoys hanging out with her puppy crew and exploring nature, which she believes is the most healing place to be. It is really a pleasure to introduce Brittany. We've worked very closely with Brittany, and she has been a great supporter. And we're so happy to have you here to talk about the family caregiver, to bring the perspective of the family caregiver caring for someone with a TBI. Welcome, Brittany.
Martha, I really appreciate that. And thank you, Clint. I always enjoy your presentations. I actually was at one of your presentations a couple years back, so it's really nice to see you again. And there are quite a few things that Clint touched on that definitely I can relate to, and I'm sure that those caregivers that we have watching can relate to. So I hope that I can just share some information that I found helpful and useful to help you in this caregiving journey. Alrighty, so let's go to the next slide. So, one of the things about caregiving that I found most challenging was caring for myself. And in doing so, I forgot myself. And one of the things that I did was I created this mind model to help me navigate when I was in situations that I couldn't necessarily care for myself, which when you're a caregiver, that's almost every day. You find yourself in situations where you cannot put your needs first. So I needed to find a way that I could put my needs in front of myself and notice them and acknowledge them. So let me back up just a little bit. I was a caregiver for about 4 years to a disabled veteran. Initially, just like Clint, I didn't consider myself a caregiver, but I think that this was mostly due to the stereotype that kind of comes along with the word caregiver. I think we all associate caregiving as, someone that appears to need care, whereas the person that I was caring for was suffering from the invisible wounds, which were it was really difficult. It was really, really hard because it wasn't right in front of anyone. And so for me to reach for help, it seemed kind of like a stretch until I think when I really realized that I needed help was when I started to look inwards and I realized how lonely I felt. And I wasn't necessarily lonely because nobody was there. I was lonely because I didn't feel as though anyone could really relate to what I was going through. And so I was super grateful when I found the Southern Caregiver Resource Center because that was a place that I could go and I could rely on that relatability and the support without that judgment and without that typical stereotype of what a caregiver is, even though the person that I was caring for, you couldn't see her wounds. So getting back to my mind model, I found this incredibly useful because a lot of times I was in situations where I needed to think quickly, whether it be a crisis or at an appointment or, just out, in large crowds. And there were times that I became overwhelmed. There were times that I became upset, that I was angry, that I was sad, but I could not prioritize my needs in those moments. So I came up kind of with this model. So the M is for me, because I'm going to focus on me. I would go through, what am I feeling? And sometimes I just didn't know how I was feeling, and that's perfectly fine. And then I would say, now I'm going to recognize these feelings or lack thereof. And then the D is the most important letter, because this is where you need to designate that space or set those boundaries so that you can explore those feelings more. So I didn't necessarily get to the D at the time whenever I was in that situation, but I did say to myself, okay, I'm going to designate some time tonight to really sit down with my thoughts and kind of go through, what am I feeling? Why was I feeling this way? And how can I handle this better next time around, or just be more prepared? And it also just brought me back to my own identity, which you can go ahead and go to the next slide, because this was key for me when I was caregiving. I will be completely honest. I totally lost my identity when I was a caregiver, until I found the Southern Caregiver Resource Center and was able to work through different things to better understand who I was and what I needed as a caregiver. So I just listed some different things under self-identity, some different terms that I never had thought of. I mean, of course I had thought of them, but I don't think I really took a dive into them until I, intentionally sat down and thought about them. So the green is the good, and the red is the, okay, maybe we should stop and put the brakes on a little bit here. So self-concept, that's obviously the concept that you have of yourself, based on your beliefs. Self-care, which stretches beyond just going and getting your nails done and your hair done, which is great, and which we all love to do. But you have to be intentional with that self-care for your mind. And if you don't set aside that time for that self-care to look inwards, you're going to get burnt out and you're going to become exhausted way quicker. Self-compassion was another thing that I really had to work on. I had so much compassion for other people, but I realized that the compassion for myself was really lacking. I wasn't allowing myself to feel things that I needed to feel so that I could become better and do better. Self-awareness, which I think we can all use some self-awareness. Again, it's not easy, because you're so in tuned and aware of the person that you're caring for, that yourself is definitely not something that you're going to be aware of, especially if you're out and you're trying to socialize, the person that you're caring for, and you're being so mindful of their needs and aware of what they need and all of the different triggers. And so I really had to work on the self-awareness to be able to tune into myself. And then self-love, and we could all use some self-love. I think just loving the fact that what you're doing is so helpful and so great, that without you, that this individual, may not be able to do what they're doing. And so just loving yourself through allowing yourself to be aware of your needs, and taking care of yourself. And then there's the red that I've got here kind of highlighted in red, because these were things I also didn't think of. I never thought I was self-sacrificing anything. I just thought it was my job. I thought that, okay, this is my partner. I'm going to take care of her. Self-sacrifice was never on my radar until it was mentioned to me, and I thought, wow, I am sacrificing a lot, and in doing so, I need to give myself a lot so that I'm able to make the sacrifices that I'm making. So I definitely think that when you're sacrificing, you need to be mindful and aware of how much you're sacrificing so you don't lose your identity. And then self-denial, I think that really goes hand in hand a lot of times with the person that you're caring for, because in my particular situation, there was a lot of denial from the person that I was caring for, just because it was so tough. And, she was a veteran. And as Clint had mentioned, they are trained to, be soldiers, be that warrior. And so I think that the denial really carried over to me, and I started denying myself of the needs that I had, and what I needed to be able to take better care of other people. There was no way that I could be the best me unless I knew who I was. And I struggled with that quite a bit. And I'm really grateful, though, that through the Southern Caregiver Resource Center and the services that they offered me, I was able to really find myself again and take care of me, because it's important for, you know, us caregivers to value ourselves and to value our worth, and we do that through our actions and through our self-care and self-love and self-awareness. um, so I wanted to share a little bit with you about the services that the Southern Caregiver Resource Center does offer, because there are so many. And I think that the one that I mostly benefited from, go ahead, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The one that I really benefited from the most was the short-term counseling. The short-term counseling was about 6 sessions, and I remember the first time that I met with someone at the Southern Caregiver Resource Center, I walked in and I felt like my world was just a jumbled mess. I I didn't really have an identity anymore. I was so enmeshed in this person that I was caring for in their world. But when I met with this counselor, I was really able to, it was just for me. It wasn't for the person that I was caring for. It was just for me. So I was able to really kind of lay everything out on the desk almost. You can kind of visualize that, and really just see what I needed. And so I'm forever grateful for that. And then after I did the short-term counseling, because it was only about 6 sessions, which was great at that time, I was able to get referred to another local nonprofit that offered me more counseling. And so I was able to kind of continue that on. The support groups was also another thing that I absolutely loved. At the time, the support groups were in person, which was great, but we are still offering the support groups virtually, and they're still amazing. So, you know, that was great. I remember one of the support groups, I was sitting next to someone, and she just looked really overwhelmed and just kind of sad. And we started talking, and by the end of our conversation, the both of us were just laughing because we had so much in common, and we were able to relate. It was that relatability that made me feel okay, that made me feel like my worth is really, I'm worthy of, you know, taking care of me and not losing who I am while caring for this individual who really does need me. We also offer family consulting, which is great. They can assess needs that you have. Different types of case management services are also offered, which can be really useful because you kind of pinpoint exactly what you need, where to look in the community. Because I know as a caregiver, you are thrown a ton of resources for the individual that you're caring for, and maybe a little bit for you, but you oftentimes put that at the bottom of the pile, and then you go ahead and put all the stuff for the person that you're caring for at the top. But at the Southern Caregiver Resource Center, the case management is just for you. And so that was extremely helpful. There's also the employee resources, legal and financial consulting, which is great. The Together Care Respite is excellent. Respite care is wonderful, especially if you have a hard time leaving the individual that you're caring for. Respite is a great way to just take that break. I know the feelings that you may feel of guilt and leaving the person that you're caring for at home or wherever while you go out and take care of yourself. But you have to understand that this is essential for you to be able to take care of this individual. You have to do these things. And so with respite care, you're offered, someone can come and help you and take care of your loved one while you kind of just go out and take care of yourself. And that's it's vital. It's so important. And then the Reach to Caregiver program, that's a great program. It's specifically for caregivers that are working with individuals that have challenges with memory loss, as well as dementia and Alzheimer's. And I know that can be an incredibly taxing and incredibly just really a heartbreaking experience, because a lot of times you love this person that you're caring for, and it's difficult to see them go through the challenges of losing their memory. So it's great to have that support and other people surrounding you that can really relate to you. Again, that relatability piece is so important. All right, next slide, please. And then, as Martha had mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, there is the iCare portal, which is incredibly helpful. We also have a podcast, which I think is neat. It's kind of fun. You can kind of tune into the podcast and just kind of listen in and just relate to what is being said. And it's kind of a glimpse inside your world. And it's not one that you really get to see too often. So I'm super grateful that the Southern Caregiver Resource Center has that podcast. And then there's the Caregiver Corner, where you can get more resources. There's some short video clips with caregiving tips. And the family consulting is, I think family consulting is, yeah, the family caregiver classes is on there as well, which is incredibly helpful. And, I can't say enough about the Southern Caregiver Resource Center, because I was in a place of, I wouldn't say desperation, because I didn't really realize that I needed what I needed until I started to understand that I was alone, but not really. And I think that was a scary and hard place to be. But when I found out that I didn't have to be alone, that was really what I would say really kind of saved me in finding myself again and becoming happy again, and becoming fulfilled again, and not just feeling as though I was kind of going through the motions of caregiving. So you can also follow us. I think, is there a slide? Do we have a slide for our social networking? No, we don't. But I can tell you, we are on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we have a Twitter, and then we also have our YouTube channel. So if you guys are interested in any of those, please go to our website, caregivercenter.org, and you can find more information on that and ways to connect. We definitely keep those social outlets updated with material, and it's nice to kind of just be able to zone out and go on the internet and just learn how you can do better for yourself. Like Clint said, it's you just have to keep learning and always learning, because you can't change anyone. You can love them, and I think to love them, you have to understand them, and that goes for yourself too. To love yourself, you have to be able to understand yourself. And so with that, I'm so grateful for the Southern Caregiver Resource Center and Martha and Clint. And I just think all the caregivers that are here, I know what you're going through is very difficult at times. And I just want you to know that you are so treasured, and we are so grateful for all of you and all that you do. And you are so important. And don't ever forget that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brittany. Those are very inspiring words. And I really appreciate that you really talked about that self-care, which we often talk about, but we don't really practice. It is very true that all of us who have ever been caregivers, that we often give of ourselves and therefore forget ourselves in the process, especially right now during this really, weird period that we're all living in, during this pandemic and socially isolated. We're taking on more without even realizing. You have kids, and maybe you're helping them through distance learning, or you're caregiving with your elderly parents, and you're worried about COVID, and all of that added stress that's usually not here with us is compounding this problem. And so absolutely. I'm so glad that you talked about self-care and really being able to have that compassion. And so I wanted to open it up at this time. We have a couple of questions, and we have great questions, and I hope that we're able to get to them all, because I want the caregivers who are listening, or the friends of caregivers who are listening, to make sure that you really bring this message home to people, that you can ask for help, not a sign of weakness, sign of strength, like Clint was saying, and to have that self-compassion, like Brittany mentioned. So Clint, I think this question is for you, but of course, feel free, either of you, to jump in. Um, the question is, okay, so there's a diagnosis. You've had a traumatic brain injury. All the tests have been done. What is the first step for the caregiver now? What should that person do?
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now? Awesome. So the diagnosis is done. They've been to an initial treatment or rehabilitation. What is the first step that the caregiver should start embarking on? And I would say well, let me back up. Number one is to set and develop an attitude that you're going to learn as much as you can about this whole process. And then that can begin with learning what was the diagnosis, learning about the healthcare team, if there is a case manager, learning that, pulling all the resources that you can use to learn more. And let's say I think you did mention in the case of a TBI, if you are associated with a military person, you need to be familiar with the TBI Center of Excellence resources, because literally almost everything you need to know can be found there. And anything that's not there, there is a regional education coordinator somewhere in the country that's responsible for your region that can point you in the right direction. So, number one, set a goal, develop the attitude that you're going to start learning as much as you can about this topic. Number two, start building a relationship with the healthcare team. Do not be afraid. I mentioned this earlier. Do not be afraid to ask questions. Do not be afraid to voice how you're feeling. If you're becoming stressed and you feel you're starting to lean into the caregiver burnout, do not be afraid to mention that. And that's another topic you also want to start mastering, is caregiver burnout. Hopefully that touches on that question.
Yes, and I just got a question that came through that says, what if you are struggling with that identifying term of caregiver? And it's so true, right? That's something that
Yep.
we as at SCRC struggle with, right? Clinton, you mentioned it at the
Exactly.
beginning. You didn't even know you were a caregiver. I'm sure, Brittany, you went through that same experience. I did the same when I was caregiving. It is really not a term that we're used to. However,
Hmm.
there are so many people out there who are caregivers, who are caring for their spouses, their parents, their partners, their friends, their relatives, their neighbors, and might not even realize. And I think that's what we have to kind of step back a little and take stock in, because if you are a caregiver, then you can easily search for caregiver services. But if you don't identify with the term caregiver, then that's not for me. I'm not a caregiver.
Yeah.
You're not talking to me. But it's really important. Perhaps, Brittany, what finally kind of broke through to you that you realized, oh, okay, I'm a caregiver?
Well, okay, so to answer that question though, it's funny, I was actually just thinking, um, throw out that stereotype that you have for caregiver, because once I did that, I was able to kind of put the giving before the care, and I was giving care. And I was able to kind of process that a bit differently. I think it's also challenging for the individual that you're caring for, because especially, military, um, it's hard for them to accept that they need care, because they were the ones that were caring, for our country. Um, and for me, I think it was when I started to realize that the people around me and the people I was surrounding myself with, they didn't understand what I was going through. It was different. It wasn't, the level of care that I was offering was different than the level of care that you typically offer your partner, your spouse, your loved one. That was when I really started to kind of hone in on it. And, the lonely piece really was what got me. I just sat with myself, and I really looked inward, and I realized how lonely I was. And it wasn't because nobody was there. There were people there. It just that there wasn't anybody that understood what I was going through. And so when I kind of got that stereotype of caregiver out of my head, I was able to really dive in and look for resources and get connected. And that was everything, because then I had the relatability piece. So
I like the way you put it, giving care, which is what we all have done, especially some of us are continuing to do. This next
yep.
question has to do with rehabilitation. Now, I know, Clint, that you talked about this, and I am glad that we really went into the whole rehabilitation piece, because I wasn't even sure that that was something that could be possible given the injury to the brain. You explained how the brain moves in the skull, and with that type of rehabilitation for a TBI situation, how important is it for that individual to be reintegrated into kind of the normal way of doing things, but also for the family to have some patience with that rehabilitation?
So it's always important to strive to help that person living with the traumatic brain injury reintegrate as much as possible back into what was normal for them. But we always have to remember, depending on the severity of the injury, a percentage of persons living with traumatic brain injury, they may have to create, and the caregivers may have to begin to create a new normal. Now, if you're having to create a new normal, or you're in the process of reintegrating that person, it is vitally important, and it's vitally important for family members to realize the family network is a critical component of this. As I mentioned earlier, the healthcare profession, or the TBI treatment profession, didn't focus on family members until they realized how important the actual family member is to the rehabilitation. So once you take that into account, you as that family caregiver, that family member, understand that, yes, this is critically important, and it all begins with starting to learn the topic. And I think a real easy way to start learning is to visit the Southern Caregivers Resource Center's website, visit the TBI Center of Excellence website if it's TBI related, because the information is right there. And as Brittany mentioned, and I'll expand on what Brittany actually said, there's 53 million caregivers in America. 5.5 of those 5.5 million are in California. And right here in Southern California, we have 420,000 caregivers, and there are tons of organizations. You don't have to struggle. Find the network, and you can start right here at Southern Caregivers Resource Center. Call and say, hey, where's the closest network that I can get involved with, so that you don't struggle as you progress and process.
And you just reminded me, Clint, I know a lot of maybe members in our audience might be from Southern California. And if you are from other parts, if you live in other parts of California, you could also access our network of caregiver resource centers. We are actually one of 11 throughout the state, and you can visit caregivercalifornia.org. Services might vary depending on the different communities, but we are still focusing on the family caregiver, because like Clint said, with 5 million caregivers in the state of California, that's a lot. That's a great need, and we need to make sure that we are there to support all of you. My next question, and of course, again, feel free. Yes.
One last little note on that topic is some families are highly engaged in the caregiver activities, and some families are less engaged. Regardless to the level of engagement, the family is critically important to the recovery and the treatment of that loved one. Also, sometimes the caregiver isn't a family member. And I heard Roberto talk about this on the video. Caregivers can be anyone. They can be friends. They can be associates. They can be and what was that? 15% of them live more than an hour away from the person they're caring for. And at the foundation of whoever the caregiver is, if it's a family unit, to help that family develop, or the family should look to develop resiliency. And there may be three main areas of family resiliency, and one is creating a positive mental attitude, thinking positive about the outcome. You don't want to go into this negative. We have a saying that I was taught by one of my mentors in this field. When we talk to patients about TBI, we want to teach them about positive expectations to the outcome of their event. Also, something called the optimum family organization, teaching families how to build an optimum family organization so that family works together like a well-oiled machine, all helping out this loved one that may have experienced a traumatic brain injury. And then the last component, I don't know if there's much more important than the family unit as part of developing resiliency, mastering the art of communications. You have to be able to communicate your feelings. You have to be able to communicate your desires, not only to other family members, but if you're advocating for that loved one, you may have to be the one advocating or communicating with the healthcare team. That's it.
And it kind of leads into my next point, Clint, because it's very true. A lot of times we are so dependent on this one person in our family and assume that one person is going to take care of it all. But sometimes we might have to rely on people differently. Maybe there's one person who does the online banking, the other one does the day-to-day errands, the other one is the cleaning, and the other one's the cooking. I mean, there's so many ways that families can really help and come together with different types and levels of care. It doesn't have to be the one person do it all and then the rest feeling like, well, I guess I'm off the hook. I don't have to worry about anything. I know that also with caregiving, there is a big sense of guilt. You want to make it all go away. You want to do more. And maybe if you do more, the person will feel a lot better. But there's also that awareness of a level, a limit of what you can do. Brittany, is that something that you felt when you were a caregiver, guilt? And did that stop you from maybe connecting to some resources that could have been helpful?
Absolutely. Guilt was a huge part of every day because anything that had to do with myself, I associated guilt with it. So if I, needed to go for a run, I even felt a sense of guilt in doing that because I knew that I was needed and my care was needed. So yeah, that was a huge challenge. That was probably one of the biggest challenges for me, was understanding why I was feeling guilty and working through that and working through the shame and the fact that I wasn't recognizing myself. Because I also, there was guilt and then there was shame and they kind of coincide. So that was tough. It was really, really tough. But once I was able to acknowledge it and be aware of what I was doing, that was when I was able to take those steps to understand that this guilt that I'm feeling is totally normal. And what I'm doing right now is I have to do this. This is for myself. I have to do this. And with time, the guilt started to dissipate, but it definitely was really, really tough, especially when you're the main caregiver, when you're the go-to person, when you're the person that's on call, when you're the one that, is thought to be the one that can fix the situations. Absolutely. Guilt was huge and it was tough. It was hard to work through that. Very, very hard.
And I guess what we can say is that guilt is a part of the human condition, and it's okay to feel
Absolutely.
guilty, but it's that, what do you do with it? And recognizing what else can you do to help that situation, help yourself and help the individual during that time.
Yeah.
We are running out of time, my friends, and we can be here for a long, long time. I have such a great interest and a lot of questions, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe leave us with some lasting words or last comments that would be of benefit to our audience today. And whoever wants to start, I leave it up to you.
Ladies first.
You know, I know that there's probably some people out there that might kind of classify themselves as a caregiver. And I just want to be completely frank. There's no such thing as a kind of caregiver. You're a caregiver. If you're questioning whether you're a caregiver, you're a caregiver. And just like I said before, giving care can oftentimes be an easier way to kind of look at it, especially in the beginning, because it can be really tough to admit that, you know, you're a caregiver for someone, especially if it's somebody that you love. But, you know, I really, really hope that, you know, people don't have to get to that place of feeling lonely, that they know that they're not alone, that we're here for them, that we support them, and we understand the sacrifices that they're making. And, you know, we're really grateful for them, and we're here for you guys, and we'll be here. So please reach out, please, please, please. It helps immensely. It's hard in the beginning. It's hard to prioritize yourself. I know I was always at the bottom of my prioritization list for many years until I, you know, tuned into that self-awareness and understood that I needed to prioritize myself to get past. And I know Clint mentioned that whole anger piece. And I think that that's huge. Like, I definitely was in that boat too, where I became really quick to anger in certain situations. And it was because I wasn't taking care of myself. So please reach out. So, you know, we can help you learn and understand how to take better care of you. Thank you. Thank you for being a caregiver, and you are wonderful.
Thank you, Brittany. Clint?
Awesome. We've covered a lot of information. We've shared a lot of information, and I like to end most of my presentations with some kind of action. So we've told you all of this stuff, but as most people are aware, information and education isn't enough to change behavior. So I'm going to now leave you with a couple of action steps. As a caregiver, you got to look out for you. You have to take care of yourself, and that's what this was all about. You still come first, because if your health declines, you're not going to be much help to the person you're caring for. So what do you need to do? Number one, you have to find ways to manage the stress. Find the mind-body modalities. Maybe you're going to do yoga, maybe meditation. In other words, learn something to manage your stress. First thing you should do, learn something. Number two, you got to exercise. There isn't many other things better than exercise for brain health. And it is brain health that plays a major role in your overall health to care for the person you're caring for if you're the caregiver. So you gotta find ways to manage your stress. You need to exercise. You have to eat healthy. Got to start finding ways to get good nutrition and eat healthy. And then last but not least, do not be afraid, as Brittany alluded to, do not be afraid. Find networks. Find people that you can get around, that you can speak with, you can share with, you can talk about your challenges. Do not be afraid to do that. And do not be afraid to raise those topics with your healthcare provider. Number one, manage your stress. Number two, you have to exercise. Number three, you got to eat healthy. And number four, you have to build that social network that will help you through this whole process. And with that, I think I'm done.
You are both amazing. Thank you so much for being here. It was really a pleasure to hear from you and educate us and really share with us your stories and your experiences. You heard it, folks. Educate yourselves, connect. Don't be afraid to ask for help. We are here to support you. Visit www.scrc.care or give us a call directly at 1-800-827-1008. or 858-268-4432. We are concluding our program, but again, feel free to connect to us through our social media. We have our YouTube channel, and of course, Take care of yourselves. Remember, SCRC is here to care for you and care for those who care for others. Thank you and have a great day.